So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. We really appreciate you making time to join us today for this webinar from Anthesis around the subject of archive management. We're giving it the subtitle of Clearing Out the Attic, Clearing Out Your M3 Attic. If I can just go through some brief housekeeping before we actually begin. When you joined the webinar today, you were obviously asked to choose how you wish to do so, either by phone or by computer audio. You can change your selection at any time by accessing the audio panel within the control panel area on the right-hand side of your screen. However, when you have chosen your preferred method of connection, we would ask that you remain on mute at all times to avoid any background noise or feedback during the session. Later, you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions of today's presenter. However, you can actually register a question at any time by typing your question into the question panel on the right-hand side of the control area. Again, we will address these points in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Finally, we remind you again to please keep yourselves in mute during the duration of the event. Now it gives me pleasure to hand you over to our presenter for today, Simon Gartside. Over to you, Simon.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. My name is Simon Gartside, and my background with M3 dates back to 1992 when I first started working with the product as MoveX. I worked for Intentia, for Lawson, and for Infor in many roles as a project manager, a consultant, a services manager, and for the last 11 or 12 years with Infor as the manager of the M3 upgrade team. So I managed the team that upgraded customers from version to version, and that's where my interest in M3 databases and the management of the data in those databases come from, because we spent an awful lot of time migrating an awful lot of customer data to latest versions, and a lot of that was junk. So hence my interest in archiving and data management in M3. So yes, the title of this is Clearing Out Your Attic. M3 archiving, to get rid of obsolete or historical data, and to put it bluntly, the junk that accumulates in your M3 database. And the opportunity is, if we do this right and we put in a place of a schedule of archiving, this can be a one-off exercise, and your data will be effectively managed going forward to future-proof yourself. Some M3 customers manage this process well and have taken on board archiving, but I have to say I think most M3 customers do not and do not take an active part in this, or certainly that's the case historically. So what are we going to cover this morning? The three things we'll cover is, and that's what I hope at the end of this session, the three things you will remember are why you should possibly consider archiving your M3 data if you don't do that already. Secondly, what's actually involved in archiving M3 data. That's from a functional point of view and a bit about the project. And also to tell you about a great offer from Anthesis to help you get started on an archiving project in the right way, in effect, a kickstart to an archiving project. So I hope those are the three takeaways that will emerge from this morning's session. Okay, so let's look at M3 data. Every M3 customer's data has a root. It starts off as gold. So for example, you're a newly live customer or live for a year. All the data in your M3 database is likely to be extremely valuable. Over time, a proportion of that data turns from gold into junk. So for example, if you have 1-year-old purchase costing data, that's very valuable. If it's 15 years old, maybe it's junk. Similarly with stock transactions or completed rental agreements, depending on whatever industry you're in, it's highly likely that over time, in fact almost certain, that a great proportion of that data that you've got in your M3 database is not actually relevant to anything or useful or accessed even, and therefore could be is actually junk. There is also some stuff in M3 which is not valuable transaction data that builds up. So for example, work file data or even stream server related data that actually builds up and which actually is is never really accessed. So pretty much from day one, M3 gathers data which you might classify as junk, and it's very good at that. It's good in one way. You want your application to not to lose data, but it's fair to say I think that M3 is very good at building this data up. It's not quite so good at on its own doing its own housekeeping to get rid of data that you don't actually need. Now, of course, there are legal requirements in place, means that some data you have to keep, to be able to reproduce invoices, etc., or accounts. But the default position with M3, which is endless amounts of data are collected until everything slows to a stop, really does not make a great deal of sense. And in my humble opinion, M3 should be delivered with archiving already configured, but and I've discussed this with M3 product management, this hasn't happened. So it's up to us to take stock of the situation and to take the appropriate action. Okay, so next look at why you should consider doing archiving in M3 if you don't do that already. Okay, so why should you run M3 archiving? Well, the primary reason is that running M3 archiving and purging can significantly reduce the size of your M3 database or databases by removing this junk. And just by the way, to define purging, archiving is data that's saved off to another area. Purging is just simply clearing out surplus data. So of course, reducing the size of your database can have many potential benefits. And the first one there is better response times in your M3 applications. So for example, historically, typically, general ledger inquiries were something that significantly slowed down with large volumes of data. And in some areas, the application is designed in a slightly interesting way, such as tickler notes, which I'm told they display in chronological sequence. So users would have to wade through lots of historical data to get to the valuable current data. Clearly, archiving the data then can have beneficial effect on some response times, not just interactively, but also batch jobs and overnight jobs and so forth. And of course, if you have a smaller M3 database, every time you do the save operations or restore operations or copy operations, so many customers will regularly copy their production database to their test or the development environment. Of course, if the database is much smaller, all these activities are going to take much less time. Similarly with service windows. Now, lots of M3 customers are working more and more around the clock, so service window opportunities are important. So obviously, if you are doing save activities or copy activities in those service windows, reducing that database size is going to give you a longer service window, and you get into this virtuous circle where you have more time, more downtime available to do more maintenance, housekeeping, or archiving rather than less time. So if you get in a situation where the opposite of a virtuous circle, a vicious cycle where you don't have time to do the essential maintenance tasks that you need to do to reduce the to increase the service window. If you are considering data migration or upgrade to a different version or to cloud or whatever, then obviously with a smaller database, that process will go more quickly, and more quickly normally means less expense or effort, and of course lower risk, because if you're doing anything like that, the longer contingency period you have is better. And if your disks are full, of course, if you reduce the size of your database, maybe you won't have to buy more disk, potentially. And I'll just give you one example from a customer we worked with last year. We worked with a customer last year, and we were able to reduce their M3 production database size by almost 40% just by running one simple housekeeping job within a couple of weeks of the project. I mean, that's an exceptional situation, I would say, but it's not entirely unknown. So therefore, clearly you can see the obvious benefits of having a database that's suddenly 40% smaller. So those are the positive reasons why you might want to consider doing M3 archiving. There are some potentially negative ones. So, and I've entitled this, "Don't Paint Yourself into a Corner." And it's true to say that if you're running archiving in M3, that archiving process itself can take a considerable time to run, many hours. And I will talk about when you can run archiving a bit later, but it's clearly a good idea to avoid getting into a situation where you have so much data you don't have time to archive it in the available window. So in a sense, you've painted yourself into a corner. You need to reduce the size of the database, but you don't have the downtime available to do that. The other point is, of course, if your disks are 96% full, it's going to be difficult to do archiving, because counterintuitively, archiving temporarily needs extra disk space because you're saving data off into a separate M3 environment. The size will reduce, of course, but temporarily you will increase the disk usage. Now, as in most things, there is a way around this. So if you did have a very full disks, the way to tackle that and do archiving would be to address areas of data where you could purge it first to make room for the archiving. As usual, there is a way around, but it's a bit more effort, and obviously doing things in a timely fashion where you do have that available resource is better. There are also actually physical table size limits on M3 files. It's not an M3 thing, it's a hardware thing. So if you run M3 on an iSeries, there is a physical limit to any table of 4 billion records. And I believe in Windows SQL, it's a similar limit. Now that seems an extraordinary number, but I know of 2 customers who have approached these, one a little while ago and they've taken action to address, and one I was analyzing a database last week and found another customer who have got 3.4 billion records now in one table. Now, I don't actually know what will happen when that is reached, but I'm pretty sure it would be pretty unpleasant. So obviously, we need to take action if you're approaching those table size limits, and that will, of course, be customers with very large transaction volumes, but again, it's not unknown, then action needs to be taken. If you are in that situation, so for example, I know one customer who were approaching 4 billion records, they have addressed the issue, but they had so much data, the actual archiving functions were taking literally weeks to run. So they've ended up, I believe, having custom archiving functions written, which can fix exceptional problems. That's fine. As in most things, there is always a way around to solve the problem. But addressing the archiving in a timely fashion now, so you can use standard M3 archiving functions, is going to be way easier, cheaper, and quicker. And as I said, a clear objective of any archiving projects we run is to establish a planned archiving schedule so that data is regularly archived at, say, quarterly or half-yearly or yearly intervals, so that the management of the growth of the M3 database is then managed going forward. And therefore, in one sense, that means that an archiving project can be almost a one-off exercise. Okay, so next, let's look at clearing out this junk from your attic, archiving functions in M3. Now, as I said, M3 is very good at collecting large volumes of data, and automatically it doesn't get rid of that data. Base M3 has, I believe, 43 standard archiving or purging functions built in. That's built into the standard base M3 business engine application. There is also a product called Transaction Archive Management, which is an add-on product. So you don't necessarily get it with base M3, you have to select it. And that sort of sits on top of the M3 archiving functions itself. So let's have a little look at and it helps to manage that, and I'll deal with that in a bit more detail a little later. So let's actually look at how M3 archiving works. So here on the left, you have a standard M3 database, a production database in this case. And at the start of the archiving project, you create an M3 archive database, which is basically an empty copy of an M3 database. You obviously need to set archiving parameters, and each individual archiving function, whether it's for archiving manufacturing orders or sales statistics or invoices or ledger data, whatever, will have its own set of parameters related to that particular function. So you set those parameters, you will then run archiving functions, and that's either directly with the M3 archiving functions or via this transaction archive management layer. And then that will submit batch jobs which will archive the data, and that means reading the data, selecting it, writing it to the archive environment, and then deleting it from the source. Not terribly complicated. And then the archiving functions automatically create the tables in the archiving database. As I said, it's not an instant process. It can take a considerable time to run, and that needs to be managed, of course. So the obvious question is, when can you run archiving? Well, for most of the archive functions, you could actually run it while you are still transacting. For example, it might well be that you could decide to run sales statistics archiving while you're still up and running transacting. That's fine. There are some archiving functions you would definitely not want to do that with, such as stock transaction history or ledger data, because that archiving function is actually modifying the data in the production database. Having said that, most customers really do prefer to run archiving when users are off the system, and that obviously can be is a consideration if for example, your test environment is running in the same hardware platform as your production environment. You wouldn't want to run testing of archiving, particularly if you have heavy transaction periods. So archiving actually has an impact on performance. It's not a huge impact, but it does have one. So you have to be very careful about running it. And obviously, if you're running production archiving, typically you would not want to do that while your users are transacting. It could be done if you had to for a lot of functions, but again, mostly you would not want to do that. What about recovery? If, for example, in the unlikely event that data is archived and it's realized that actually it shouldn't have been archived and it's actually still being accessed and used, for the vast majority of archive functions in M3, it's taking the data unchanged from the production database into the archiving database. So recovery is a very simple operation of actually copying the data back. As I said, ledger archiving and stock transaction history is a little bit more is different because it does transform the data. So that would not be so straightforward. Everything's possible, of course, but it would not necessarily be so straightforward. Okay, so in this scenario here, we've done some archiving. Does that actually free up the space? Well, no. Let's have a look at how that is actually done. So in this example here, take this example where after an archive run, we've archived a table such as sales statistics, and we've got 10 million live rows or records in that file, and 5 million have been deleted. The simple act of archiving doesn't free up that space. The freeing up of the space is actually done by, in an iSeries speak, reorganizing that file, or in Windows speak, compacting that database. So this is something you have to do actually after the archiving run, and this process most definitely requires a completely dedicated M3 environment. You cannot have anything running affecting those tables while you're doing that process. And how long does that take? Well, that rather depends on how much archive data is in the table. For example, if you had a table of 100 million records with 99 million deleted through archiving, that would be very quick to reorganize. If you've got 100 million records or rows with only 1 million deleted, that might take a long time to do this reorganize. Again, it's something to look at and manage. Okay, so we talked about archiving and TAM. Let's just have a quick look at what the difference is. So here we have along the bottom there, individual M3 archiving functions such as OAS 95 customer order invoice archiving, OSS 80 sales stats, etc., etc. And there are 43 of those. Transaction archive management sits on top of that, as the name suggests. And what it provides is an additional level of arena to control the archiving process and manage it, to monitor it, to get statistics from it, to do scheduling, and it also provides some simple inquiry views on top of the actual 43 specific M3 archiving functions. And very useful it is too. Question: can you archive or purge without the transaction archiving management layer? Well, the answer is yes, of course you can. You can directly invoke those M3 functions such as OAS 80 to archive your sales statistics. That's fine, and it will submit the job and it will run the same functionally, but it does make it a bit more involved to manage. So, for example, I was running a live archiving on sales stats for a customer over the weekend. Because I have transaction archive management in place, I could easily monitor the process and how many records it was archiving per hour, and therefore calculate a rough endpoint. I could see what the submission parameters were and get ongoing statistics on what's going on. So it's very useful, and probably means he's probably spend a bit less time doing the work. But you could do an archiving project without TAM. Okay, so this is all good stuff. Why wouldn't every M3 customer be doing this? Well, that's a good question. And I would say 4 things about that. One is, obviously, managing your data and M3 archiving is an important activity, but actually it is rarely very urgent. In most cases, data will grow gradually over time, and it's a long time before any crisis point is reached. I'd also say that from my time with Infor, and when I left Infor in the end of 2017, I'm not sure it's changed, but it's not really an area that Infor has ever focused on as a company, either as a services organization. And so therefore, I think not so many consultants in the M3 field or users have any great detailed knowledge of the archiving functions. Like any bit of software, it has its little rules and glitches or wrinkles rather than glitches. And I don't think there are many people around with experience of using it. I'd also say historically that many customers regarded it as rather risky. I think if you go back a very long time, back to pre-M3 days, maybe there was a bit of a question mark about some of the functionality, but that's years and years and years ago. And if you can actually so easily recover the data, then I don't see it as being a particularly risky process at all. And of course, there is a proper way of doing an archiving project to make sure that risk is managed. Anyway, most customers I think would benefit from addressing the M3 archiving issue. And at Anthesis, we are actually very keen to help you in this area and get an archiving project up and running. And I'll give you some details a bit later about how we hope to make that easier. So let's just have a quick look at what's involved in an M3 archiving project. If I can just bear with me one moment, I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we are, sorry about that. I think that was my laptop. So, is an M3 archiving project complicated? Well, the simple answer is no. The main project activities in an M3 archiving project would be, first of all, identifying where the great volume of M3 data is to archive, or where is the problem by functional area. So it could be typically sales statistics, it could be stock transactions, it could be ledger data, sales orders, it could even be just hidden things like work files. And where that volume of data lies in your database will depend on your industry you're working in, obviously. So first of all, is identify where you need to address what's the problem. The second point would be to decide on an archiving policy per area. So for example, how long are you going to keep sales statistics in, as a company? 10 years, 8 years, 12 years, 4 years, whatever. So a decision needs to be made for each of the function areas that's identified as an area to address, how long that data is going to be kept. I know there is some legal requirements about things like invoices and ledger data, which would typically be 7 years. But for most areas, it's a company or the owners of the data need to decide actually how long do you need to keep that data, whether it be sales statistics or detailed manufacturing costings. So once that's decided, then obviously you can run test archiving to those parameters. So if you say we're going to keep sales orders for 8 years, then we run test archiving to archive sales orders up to 8 years. And then obviously following on from that, there has to be an evaluation by the people who are responsible to say, okay, I'm satisfied that with all sales orders more than 8 years old taken away, we can function our processes are uninterrupted and unaffected, and that's okay. And then of course the next step would be to run those archiving functions in the live environment, either by manually or hopefully ongoing in a scheduled way, and including in that this kind of recovery of the disk space, as in the reorganization or compacting of the database. So it's not a very complicated process. It's quite simple. It's not, in terms of a methodology, but obviously, what are the prerequisites you need to actually be able to do that? Let's look at that. So top of that list is an M3 test environment. Now, clearly, it would be extremely, I would say necessary, but maybe not 99% necessary, to have a test environment with a full copy of the data from your production environment. Clearly, that means then you can realistically do the testing of the archiving functions. If you cannot do that by disk space, and obviously, again, there's always a solution. You'd have to do things individually and actually try and do purge activity before archiving to try and free up space to do that. So there's normally a way around, but obviously being able to run a representative test in a test environment is very, very important. Secondly, some available disk space. Again, I mentioned it before that counterintuitively, an archiving project will temporarily increase the disk usage before it comes down. If you don't have any spare disk space, again, there's always a way around. We would address archiving and purging routines to actually just clear down data first to make space to be able to do the archiving, which makes more space, etc. No, do you need the M3 TAM module or application? Well, you don't need it, but it is very useful and helpful in saving time and effort, but it's not an absolute necessity. And of course, you should be at the highest level of correction for whatever version of M3 you're on, whether it's 13.4 or whatever, to make sure you've got the latest archiving routines and functions. And now I mentioned earlier that we do have an offer now. Anthesis has an offer to try and help you get started on an archiving project. So what is that? As I said, we want to help you get started with an archiving project. So what we're offering is as an exercise, we will analyze in detail your M3 production database. We will obviously classify that, identify where the volume of data lies by functional area, so easy to understand where the data is. We'll also, as part of this exercise, flag up any danger areas, like if you were, for example, I looked at one last week, as I said, and a customer is approaching the physical limit of size of the table, so they do need to take direct action. And any quick wins you might have, like the customer I mentioned, who's able by simple housekeeping to reduce the database size by 40%. But also, as part of this process, propose what I would call an M3 archiving scope and sequence for maximum benefit with lowest effort, because typically with an M3 database, it's not universal, but I would say for 80 to 90% of customers, the top 20 or 30 tables will occupy 80 or 85% of the space used occupied. So therefore, if you're hitting those areas where there's lots of data, you get a lot of benefit for low effort. Well, by the time you get to the 100th biggest table, you're probably going to have a lot of effort for not a lot of impact. So we would propose what we determine is a sensible scope and sequence for that. It would also quantify the potential beneficial impact on your database size. So we'll model it and say, okay, if you do that, we think you will save 35% or 45% or whatever percentage of the database size you have. So we'll do all that work. We will document all that and put it into report with indicative project costs, assuming the usual sort of split of roles and responsibilities, with a template project plan. And we'll do all that for what I think is a very reasonable fixed price of £900. And if you happen to be from Europe, last time I looked, that's about €17. So that's an absolute bargain, I think, given the exchange rate. So what that will give you is, I think, if you take up this offer, you will then have any urgent issues flagged up. You will have a clear picture of the benefits that an archiving project would then give you, I think, in terms of database size reduction. You'll have the scope of that project and the approach mapped out. And in effect, in a sense, you'll have done the first bit of the project anyway, because that analysis exercise will be done part of that. And you'll also have an indication of what effort might be involved in that project and how much that might cost. So that's about it from me. I hope you found that of some interest, and thank you for your attention. And I will now throw open the forum for any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. Greatly appreciated. And we'll just go through while we're collating some information here on some questions, just some follow-up action. Just to clarify, the cost for European customers would be €980 at the current exchange rate. And this webinar has actually been recorded today and will be available for you to pass on to colleagues. You'll be able to access this shortly on our YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to all information and webinars that Anthesis have either put forward or will be putting out in the future. Just go to youtube.com and type in Anthesis Limited, and you can subscribe to follow us on there. So please, again, if you have, there are some questions coming through. If you have anything, please type it into the question panel on the right-hand side, and we will address that for you going forward. At the moment, Simon, I've got a couple that came through. Some are coming through private, some are coming through broadcast. First one I have here, you've not mentioned cloud or on-prem. Does archiving work the same for cloud and on-premises?
Good question. Well, the archiving functions are built into M3 Business Engine, and therefore, you know, they're delivered with standard M3, whether it's on-premise or in cloud. So from that sense, the answer is, of course, yes. And if you happen to be in a single tenant cloud environment, then the process would work just as I described. You know, if you talk about the multi-tenant cloud, that is a very interesting question because, well, for a start, probably M3 customers in the multi-tenant cloud have not been live long enough to actually have got round to thinking about archiving, possibly not. And the functions are there, of course, as I described. However, the question mark, the questioning tone in my voice is about what's contractual in an M3 multi-tenant environment is, and I'm not quite sure about this. So archiving does require additional space and another database. Is that covered in the agreement? I'm not sure. Would that incur additional charges? Or I'm not sure about that. I even believe that customers in the multi-tenant environment actually, you know, that some charges is based on how much disk space they use. So that might be a sort of double whammy. I don't think that's an evil plot by Info. I think it's possibly something that they're not at the top of their agenda to address. So it's a good question, and I will actually I have spoken to Info about this, but I haven't got a definitive answer. I will find that out and come back on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question we have, I'll just read out in its entirety. Is the disk space really reducing? As I understand, the archived data is transferred from the M3 database library to archiving library. This means the archiving library grows the same amount as the M3 library shrinks.
Yes, that is actually the case, but I would advise, if say you're archiving sales statistics, I would advise customers could then save off that data from the archive environment and then free up that space. So I think that would be a normal thing to do, unless there's some particularly risky environment or area where you might want to retain it in case of need for recovery. But you could always recover by restoring data anyway. So safely restoring off, I think, would then allow you to free up that space.
Okay, excellent, thank you. A follow-up question from the same delegate. Will modified table columns, in brackets, new table columns added by the customer, also be archived?
Answer, yes, can be. So that's sometimes the amount of data built up in the custom data environment is very large. So yes, you would want to address that. But again, I would subject that to the same rules about size. You identify and address those areas which occupy the most space, and whether that's standard or custom. Obviously, you might well have to build some kind of function to actually do that archiving from the custom data if it wasn't done when any modification was developed, though. Typically, it's not very complicated, but obviously, yes, that can be done as part of that process.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple more questions here that I have, but please, if there's anything you want to submit, please put it into the question panel now, and I will address that as we go forward. Next question, are there any M3 programs to archive MITTRA and NWOPTR tables?
Yes, is the answer. So
it's a short, sharp, simple question, and it's a short, sharp, simple answer on that one.
Yeah. Well, I'm 100% sure about MITRA stock transaction, MWOPTR. I believe I'm 98% sure of that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, still open for questions, so please submit if you have. There's another one which came here. I think either of us can answer this one. Can the Kickstart process be done remotely?
Absolutely, yes.
I would suggest, if I can just take that, I think that probably now more than any other time, yeah, this is definitely something that can be addressed remotely. You don't physically need a presence on site. So the conversations, discussions, the preparation for any of the process that we go through can all be done remotely initially. All right.
Yeah. I'd also say I'm working on a project currently, and at the start of the project, I visited the customer a couple of times just to say hello to people, get to know people, and have those discussions about archiving policy. But they could pretty much as well have been done remotely, so we could undertake archiving projects completely remotely, I believe, quite successfully.
Okay. A follow-up question from delegate. They asked the question on MITRA and MWOPTR. I'm just getting that for you. Your answer was yes. Can I know the programs? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I think that stock transactions is MMS 195. The other one I would have to look up, I'm afraid. But if you take the delegate's name, I will certainly inform them of that after the meeting. I will email
certainly. Yeah, the good thing about this, I'm not naming the delegates online, but we actually have a list of this, everyone. So any questions that are addressed directly, or if you'd like anything addressed privately,
I will confirm that information by email then.
Thank you very much.
MMS 195 for stock transactions history.
Okay. Another question. How do customers handle the situation if archived M3 data is still necessary for BI software and therefore must be transferred to a data warehouse or similar? That's a very good question. That's an excellent question, actually.
So if I understand that correctly, so the data is actually moved from the production environment into like a data warehouse for BI. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that's what the delegate's asking, yes.
I would assume then that once that's made that journey, if you like, then that would be safe to archive. Is that not correct? If I'm not misunderstanding?
I would, having had experience of working in the BI environment, I would back you up on that. So, but again, it's something that we can certainly take offline and clarify. And to the delegate that asked that question, and has obviously come back with, yes, you're spot on. That's exactly what he's wanting to know.
Because you know, I mean, I'm working with a customer at the moment, and it emerged that they'd got. I'm just trying to make sure I've got it, about 12 years of sales statistics data, and they actually don't use it at all because their BI system works off the production transaction tables. So the bizarre situation of building this data up and nobody actually ever looks at it. I did point out you could actually suppress M3 from actually producing that data, but they'd rather create it and then get rid of it. So, but I think if I understand the process normally, you would extract the data into your BI data warehouse, and then that's what you'd access rather than the M3 based data. So you could actually then archive it.
Yeah. We've got one other question. You may well have touched on this or potentially answered this, and how much does an archiving project usually shrink an M3 database by? Did you not touch on that in a previous answer?
Well, I mentioned that we had one exceptional customer where we could just easily, with some simple housekeeping, reduce the database by 40%. And again, to some extent, this rather depends on what you've got in your database, and that's why it's so good to do this sort of analysis exercise. And we'd find that out as part of that process. We would say you are going to lose 35%, 45%, or whatever the figure is. But I would say, you know, and how much obviously depends to some extent on how long you've been live on M3. If you've been live and have not done any live for 16 years and you've never done any archiving, we're likely to maybe make a very significant impact on the size of the database, because you'll have an awful lot of junk in there. If you went live 3 years ago, you can make an impact, but you probably wouldn't be looking at 40%. You would be looking at a lower figure. So it's a bit horses for courses. I'm trying not to be evasive in my answer, but it does rather depend on the circumstances.
Okay, thank you very much. There appears to be no other questions at the moment, unless we got the one just popped in there. Can you tell us what the simple housekeeping is to clear the 40%?
Yeah, like reorganizing tables.
Right. Okay. And to the delegate, does that simple answer just a yes or a no? Or if you want us to expand on that, we can contact you directly. Just let us know. Yeah. Okay, we'll be in contact with you directly. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. There are no further questions in the queue at the moment. Just again to say, reiterate again, thank you very much for your attendance today. We greatly appreciate customers taking time out to come along to these webinars and information sessions. It is greatly appreciated. Should you require any further details, or if there are any more questions that pop into your head, or if you have a discussion with colleagues around this and something else comes up, please contact Simon or myself directly. Our email addresses are there on the screen in front of you. We will be
a spurious MC in front of your name there on my presentation.
Yes, you do. This is not a DJ name by any chance, so no, this is
Master
just
of Ceremony. Master of Ceremony.
Thank you. So please contact Simon or I directly, and we will respond to you as quick as we possibly can. We hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar, that you take some information away from it. We look forward to engaging with you all again in the very near future. Anthesis wish you all health and safety at home or working from in your offices at the moment. Please keep in touch, and if you require anything from Anthesis going forward, please reach out to us directly. Thank you very much for your attendance, everyone. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.